What the YDI has done is given us accessible information that we didn't have, right? So when you think about from the landscape, we had graduation data. You know, we've always had that, and that's what we historically have used. We have some survey data through the student learning survey, and then schools would do kind of their school-based. What the YDI has done is given us multiple areas and a more holistic view of the health and well-being of youth that wouldn't otherwise be available. What the YDI has allowed us to do is pinpoint certain areas. So whether it be related to mental health, whether it be related to future opportunities, whether it be to this idea that, well, no, for the pandemic, I picked up a new hobby. This idea of positive childhood experiences, right? So considering from an asset lens, what's happening that builds possibility for youth and not get stuck on what, the deficit part. The work that was happening prior to us being involved with the YDI really involved creating relationships with students, moving towards more authentic engagement. Historically, and this is not uncommon in school districts, the relationship that we had with youth was, going to the same youth, perhaps youth that were in leadership roles, and maybe issues that were not of significance, right? And so the work that we were doing, could be described as bringing students in, but maybe wasn't authentic and maybe tokenizing in terms of, well, what do you think we should celebrate? What should be the Spirit Day on this, particular day? But weren't necessarily hitting issues that mattered to students. And more importantly, the marginalized students were continuing to have no voice, right? Because, as a system, and it's not any one particular person, teacher, adult's fault, but the system is built on this structure that doesn't allow those voices to come up. And so the work that we had done prior to the YDI allowed us to build the trust and relationship with students in schools to be able to move towards looking at the YDI. And I think that's been part of our process, right? That we're kind of equals at the table and that everyone's opinion matters. And when we sat down with the YDI, as adults, being open to different ways of coming to conclusion around what you're seeing, right? Based on your own lived experience. The YDI has pointed us in the right direction to then go out and talk with youth and create value, right? So as we're having conversations with youth, that we're creating these stories that reinforce that either the system is getting healthier or that we need to attend to some other things, right? And so that cycle, that feedback cycle, or that inquiry loop of, we've got a data set, we're involving others, people get to talk about their lived experience, get to share their perspective as people who are involved, or youth that are involved in the system, and that we're using that as feedback, as a way to measure the health of the system. When we engaged in that first pilot of the YDI, and we said, we want all students in our secondary schools in grade 11 to complete it, we felt confident that we were going to get a data set that was going to allow us to dig a little deeper. We wanted to have a bias towards action. We wanted to continue to invite students who hadn't historically been invited to the table, and to have some conversations around this data. We had worked previously with the MDI for a couple of years, and we knew the information that we were getting was really helpful, but we hadn't really bridged the gap of taking that information and sitting down with the youth who had completed it to have some further conversations to understand what was in that information. Initially, it started with getting a good data set through the YDI. The infographics were incredibly helpful at the outset, right? And one of our first efforts to bring students into the conversation was to use those infographics, right? And have some conversations. And so, early on in the pandemic, looking at that, created some conversations that we hadn't had before. Having the opportunity to talk to kids and talk to youth gave us some different insight, right? And I think it just allowed us to connect with youth in a different way and to involve them in some of the conversations that historically, as an organization, we just weren't yet ready or prepared to do that. With the latest iteration of the YDI, the second round of data and entering into this third cycle later this spring, to bring youth and again, we just had 50 youth gather together in downtown Vancouver with a handful of adults to really dig into that information and actively talk about what we should be doing in terms of action related to the school plans that each of our secondary schools have. And I think that's really pretty amazing work where we've invited youth to the table and they're having a say in terms of the direction and the inquiry that the schools, each of them individually, will be investigating throughout the year. So when we think about how we put this into practice, and so how did we move YDI as a survey that was completed by youth into actionable change that we're trying to create in our school and co-create it with youth, was that we took the information that was gathered from the YDI, and at the tables were youth and administrators or teachers from each of our secondary schools. And they investigated, as part of our obligation to have a school plan and our commitment to inquiry-based learning, what would be a common inquiry, again, back to the vision that we've established for secondary, what would be this co-created inquiry? And so a good chunk of the day was spent in conversation. So this idea of a dialogical process, where, as an example, at our schools, they would come up with inquiry questions such as, how can we as students support teachers to implement mental health strategies in their classroom while engaging in inquiry-based units with real assessment? Another example was, what supports do we need to foster resiliency as we journey towards life after graduation? Another one that came up, and we heard from some of the youth, how can we improve student well-being through increased training opportunities for staff on trauma-informed practice and mental health literacy? And so this idea that there's a co-constructed inquiry that's embedded within the school plan that's in alignment with our strategic direction as a school district ensures that there's a bias towards action. And so this ensures that the conversations and the spaces that we've created where youth and adults are in dialogue results in actionable items. As an example, the one around trauma-informed practice and mental health literacy training, the school has now built in a structure and training for teachers for the remainder of the year. I think it's an hour and a half every month. And a part of this is the reporting back too, right? So that youth know that there is opportunity for input, but that we'll also revisit that there's an accountability to the youth, that what they say matters. And part of how we show that is we come back to that and talk about what we're committed to. As a part of this structure, this group of 50 youth will come back a couple of times in the year. And so there's been a structure laid out where as the adults leading this with the youth, that will commit to and be engaged in some of our own adult learning around this, but that the youth will be brought back on a couple of occasions to carry on this work because it needs to go beyond just this one point in time where youth are gathered, right? And I think, early on, we would have these sessions with youth, But this year, especially with the progress we've made with the pandemic, we've just been more easily able to bring students together in larger groups to continue this work on an ongoing way. And so these inquiry questions that have been developed as a result of youth and adults being together will continue on through a structure that we've set out this year in a commitment to bring youth together to continue the conversations over time.